so much for inviting me to do this.
No, we've been enjoying your book. We had to go back and reread it because it's been like a year, and we're just like, she's super enjoying it. I get texts every once in a while, just like, oh my god, I forgot. And...
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, because I listened to what you guys said about it.
Oh my god.
When you first read it.
This is like my biggest fear. Oh.
No, it was, I mean, I approached it with some trepidation. I actually usually manage to avoid reading my reviews, and there are a number of different reasons why people do that, but, and one of them is that fear that everyone is going to hate what you've done and think that you're stupid and perverted and a bad influence on their children, all of which, of course, came with the kingdom, but then some, very nice reviews from publications and individual readers came in too, and so it got a lovely award I never expected to get. And I've had some really, really amazing emails from teenagers. When I was a teenager, we sneaked around to read stuff.
Oh, yeah.
But, maybe it was on our parents' shelves, or we all passed around that copy of Flowers in the Attic. So, the way my husband describes this book, he says, it's Game of Thrones meets The Help with a bit of Flowers in the Attic.
That's pretty accurate.
Yes, but thank you for not being one of the angry moms who wondered what the heck I was thinking.
No.
How many people contacted you like that? Like, angry parents?
Wow. I did open myself up to that question. It's more that I hear about it from people, and, once I stumbled, look, our stray cat is jumping up on the window screen.
Wants to be part of the interview, clearly.
I just fed him, but he wants more. We have 7 cats inside, so they'll be wandering through, and it's part of the charm and the brand. I'm witchy. I prefer that to crazy old cat lady. But in terms of the number of people, I stumbled across my Amazon reviews accidentally.
Mm-hmm.
And they were kind of what I expected. And my previous 2 books were published for adults. And I was thinking of this one that way, with the fairy tales, which are an adult genre as well as an adolescent one. And through a series of odd happenings, I used to work in children's books, and I stayed good friends with someone I worked for, Liz Bicknell, who is now the associate publisher at Candlewick, which means she's one of the most powerful people in publishing. Mm-hmm. And after I hurt my head, she sent me some books on audio, and I asked her for advice about breaking up with this agent I didn't really like, but who wouldn't respond to my dissatisfaction and agree that our relationship was over. And I asked Liz for advice about how to do that legally, and she asked me, well, what's your novel about? And I told her, she says, well, that sounds like something I would like to read. Really? But I realized that it was rude if I didn't send it to her. So I did, along with a note saying, I know that you're very busy, you don't have time to read this, I have no expectations, thank you so much for your help. And she called me 2 days later and she has this very plummy British accent. She said, "Susann, I'm so glad I read your novel instead of your note because I want to publish it." And I get a bit of a double take. Like, really, you're going to market this to teenagers, and it's to older teens, but still, I know that adults have problems with some of the material. I mean, I do. I don't think I could always read the kind of thing that I write about. Like, I can't watch Game of Thrones. Someone got beheaded in the first 2 minutes when I tried to see it, and that was that. Oh. But, these days, the boundaries between literary writing for what we market for teenagers versus what we market for adults, the boundaries are really erased. 55% of young adult books get bought by adults for themselves to read, not to give to a child or a student. Yeah, that's a trend that really started with Harry Potter and the Golden Compass series. Mm-hmm. And I've always read, in all age ranges, all kinds of genres, partly because I teach creative writing, so I need to know what's happening so that I can help my students reach their goals and write the kind of things they want to. And every time I undertake a project, I kind of tell myself, well, this is probably not going to work out. I know it's going to take a long time, and you should have no expectations for how it turns out, other than the pleasure of putting together a world that is sometimes an ugly and brutal world, like in the Kingdom, and yet putting it into writing makes that ugliness contained and maybe understandable in a way. I think that's what I find in some of the darker things that I read. And that's what draws me to, I think the big question of evil. Why people are evil, how we allow it to happen. It happens accidentally so often. And evil isn't always aware of itself as something evil. Like, any psychopath has an eloquent explanation for why he or she is doing what he or she is doing. And so there's a logic in that. So I think I'm anticipating probably some of the questions. Feel free to talk at any time.
Well, that kind of goes into our question about Nicholas, because definitely everything that he does in the book can be read into as evil, but in his case, he's pushing forward, doing what he wants to do. Mm-hmm. So Chelsey kind of wants to know where he came from, because it's just...
You put the question in her mouth.
Well, that was when we were coming up with questions for this. I was going on. I don't know. My big question was, what was the hardest scene for you to write? And Chelsey was like, where did Nicholas come from?
It was just so fascinating, and just his thought processes for I don't know, his medical. I'm gonna keep myself safe, and I was just like, what? Wow, that is amazing.
Yeah, so you're asking not so much where Nicholas came from as where did his penis come from?
Exactly.
Well, that too, yeah.
That's exactly. I can use that word on the vlog. I won't use some of the others.
Well, I think that's also a question that we did do a lot of research in other people who posted reviews and videos, and I think that came up in almost everything we watched. It's that was a question.
That was, his penis was one of the elements with which I started thinking about the story, actually. It's while I was still working on my first novel, Mirabilis, which freaks out lactating women because it's about a wet nurse who feeds people from her breasts. While I was working on that, I kind of woke up and there was a sentence that all the children in the royal nursery were sick. And that would throw a country into chaos, if you don't know who's going to inherit. And so I was thinking about just beds lined up and nurses taking care of them and, some conniving people who are trying to take advantage of the situation. Like Eleanor was more of a villain in earlier drafts because it's her job to take care of the children. And Isabel, in a way, is a villain because she's poisoning the children. She thinks she's helping them, but she's trying out all this Renaissance medicine that worked as explanations at the time, and people thought they saw some improvement from, pouring mercury into a wound. But, I don't see any real evil in Isabel. I think she wants to be a good mother. The really horrible person, of course, is Nicholas. And he's somewhat allied with Eleanor at the beginning, but he's willing to sell her out in order to get where he wants to go. And I am talking about his character before I talk about his member.
Of course, yes. Yes.
But, there were a lot of controversial ideas about cures at the time. Mercury really was thought possibly to heal the sores of syphilis, or guaiac, the gum of a tree from the New World, might help this disease that they associated with Columbus having discovered the New World and bringing syphilis back with him. Though the origins of the disease are debated. And Nicholas has some of that panic about syphilis, how you get it, what kind of person gets it, because at the beginning it's mostly aristocrats and prostitutes. So the people in the middle who can't afford a prostitute who is infected with syphilis, they don't get it as often. There was a widespread belief in the power of different gems to cure different ailments. Amber runs through the novel because there's amber in that part of the world, and it represents marital fidelity, true love, good health, especially good blood. It depends on which folklore book you're looking at. So Nicholas has worked out the system where he has the jewels sewn into his member, and he also prefers not to have traditional missionary sex, but to do other things, because one thing that really terrifies him is syphilis, which at the time was awful. I mean, you would go blind, go crazy. These days, don't hesitate to get a test, kids. It's a very easy cure. But actually, in developing countries, it's still a problem, partly because of the fear of it. So, yeah, and I kept thinking about this big knobby thing, and of course there's danger in having the surgery to get the jewels. So,
yeah.
Oh yeah.
It does not sound fun on modern anesthetic. Forget about back then.
True. They had a different theory of, not exactly germs, but they thought that bad smells would make you sick. Yeah, so he follows mostly what would have been Arab medicine with the jewels, and his penis is kind of scary. And when I was signing the contract, the publisher bought merchandising rights, which is normal, like, if you're going to use T-shirts or stuffed animals or something. And I was thinking, wow, what kind of merchandise would you sell for the kingdom? Like a little penis purse. Dazzle and the penis with the jewels, there are some parallels, like Japanese gangsters, the Yakuza.
Yeah.
They'll sew a pearl into theirs when they kill somebody, so it's a sign of achievement. And Filipino sailors do that with pearls too, which I didn't know until after the book was published. So there's some precedent, but mostly it is my perverted imagination. And I did shoot myself in the foot with that historical note where I get really shy about talking about stuff in progress. So when people would ask what I was writing my first novel about, I would say, well, it's about breasts, because it's about a wet nurse in the Middle Ages and she's feeding people. And my second book was about lungs. There's a tubercular artist's model in the Wild West, though the publisher said it's actually more about something lower down. And then with this one, I would say I'm writing a fairy tale about syphilis. And the angry moms who go on Amazon and on blogs really kick that up. And I have seen that as the headline for some comments. The author calls this a fairy tale about syphilis, and that's what it is. It's like, well, it doesn't mean that syphilis is good. I mean, it means syphilis is one of those manifestations of problems. And that scary step into the adult world that's embedded inside fairy tales.
I think that a lot of people have trouble with fairy tales in that regard because everybody's so used to like the watered down Disney versions, and when you go and you read the actual, they're pretty dark.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The first recorded versions of fairy tales we have, Charles Perrault, or there was Madame la Comte de Domé, I think, and the Grimm brothers. The stories don't end so tidily as they do for us now.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't that sense that you have to have a beginning, middle, an end, and a moral, and a happy ending. So, like Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty, in their earliest recorded versions, continue long after the wedding, and terrible stuff happens. Like, the mother-in-law eats the children. And they often have this ragged way of trailing off. And I think that as cultural tools, they were used a lot to warn kids. To prepare them for their bodies bleeding or for the terrible fate of marrying somebody very hairy. Mm-hmm. Then you have to find that there's a prince underneath that hairy beast. So they set these templates to guide our experience. You prick your finger on a spindle and you fall asleep. If you haven't really been told what menstruation is, it's very shocking the first time it happens. But, fairy tales, they also didn't have the same idea of a character arc and a meaning. And I wanted to write a story that did have what we expect of modern narrative, but also had that sense of, that sense that things would never really be concluded. There's always more in our stories. This one is Tova. She's named after my grandmother. It's how I wrote the little fairy tale fragments and the ones that are sometimes kind of wrong, like the wrong version of Snow White. I wrote those into the very last draft, and they gave me what I wanted about the inconclusivity of life and a certain episode in your existence. It may feel as if this is the end for you, but it might actually be somebody else's ending that you've stepped into. And I know we shouldn't talk too much about the ending.
I do really like how you ended it, the somewhat epilogue, like ambiguous epilogue. Like, that definitely reminded me of fairy tales, how there's no one real rendition of the story. You can really take it where you want to take it.
Mm-hmm. I think we had an argument.
We did have an argument about that.
Oh, you didn't like that?
No, we both had completely different interpretations.
I was like, no, this happened. She's like, I can't remember what it was now. It was so long ago but we both. It
got really heated.
It did.
I like to hear that. You cared enough to argue about it.
Oh yeah.
When we originally read this book, we were coming back from a conference, and we were killing time in a bookstore, and I found it. I was drawn to it by the cover, like even color too, like the
edge stain.
Yeah.
And so I went home, and the very first thing I did was I went online. I went and read all the reviews, and of course came across this is not for children. Why is this? And so of course that meant I needed it.
Yeah. Yes.
And so it was funny because I got it first, and I was calling her and texting her, being like, "Oh, you have to read this. This just happened. Read this book." She finished it before I did.
I downloaded it. I was like, okay, I need to see what's going on here. And I mean, we came out of it. We were like a little shocked because we didn't know what was like. We didn't have any expectation. It's so different than anything we read. And then we're sitting there and we're talking about it, and we kind of talked about censorship a little bit, and then we're like, thinking back to all the stuff we read as kids that we were kind of maybe not supposed to read, and I'm like, kids self-censor themselves is kind of what we concluded. Like, you'd be reading something and you're like, I can't deal with this, and then you put the book down, you might come back to it years later, you might never come back to it, but that self-censorship was like a big thing for like growing up, right? You decide what you can handle and what you can't. It was kind of like a step towards adulthood, so.
And then one thing I've realized going back and reading books that I read as a kid, and all the stuff that I did not pick up on that I'm picking up now, because teen fiction and young adult fiction wasn't a really big thing when we were younger.
Yeah.
So we were kind of forced to read higher, like, literary fiction.
A big crash upstairs and a whole bunch of cats yelled. I'm sorry. I think it's only recently that teenagers have been kind of prescribed a wider range of reading, or it's been made available to them. Certainly when I was in junior high and high school, and it seems like libraries always lag about 20 years behind where you are. So I was reading these romances about girls who did not fit in, and it was often because they were too fat, or they were too shy, they didn't know how to use makeup, they weren't confident, and of course I was the uber geeky, shy, scared girl, and I don't think those books were very good for me to be reading because they still held up, as the ultimate good, fitting into that little tight, awful, ingrown culture where you have to have a boyfriend and be a certain size and know how to make small talk and flirt. So it was a kind of bad master narrative to have. And now we have authors like Carolyn Mackler in The Earth, My Butt, and Other Big Round Things, which is actually the first book I have people read when I'm teaching a workshop in how to write a novel, saying like, look at how well structured this is, and hey, also look at the range of material you can present for a lot of different ages. On the very first page of that book, sex for a 16-year-old is presented as a good thing and like a goal to work toward. That was also very controversial for a bunch of moms, and then maybe kind of a gift for other moms. When I was a teenager, the current books, they were called problem novels in the publishing industry. And there would be the girl who has sex once and gets pregnant. And what does she do? She absolutely must not have an abortion. And the shame is so overwhelming. How's she going to tell her family? And I think that with The Kingdom, I was responding partly to that, even though I wasn't thinking, I'm going to try and have high schoolers read this. But there's that sense, Ava gets pregnant by a kind of unconventional method, and she has a miscarriage in public, and it's shameful for her family. Mm-hmm. And she internalizes the guilt, and she tries to think of herself as the heroine of a fairy tale, but really she has to accept that stories, any kind of fairy tale is going to have bad parts to it, and you should not blame yourself for everything that happens in your life. And the big example, which is actually the main reason I think some people find this book controversial, we haven't really talked about the rapes yet.
Yeah.
And those, women's bodies have always been like this public battleground with people telling us what we can and cannot do with them, how we should present them. Even now, I think in progressive places, the female body is still a sort of endangered sight, and it's it's dangerous for the woman herself or the girl, and it's dangerous for the people who are tempted by her. Mm-hmm. And I live in Virginia now. I'm from California, and the difference in attitudes toward some issues, it's really remarkable. And I finished The Kingdom during an election year when, right to choose was one of our hot button topics. And I kind of want to just offer comfort, and you may say I've chosen an odd way of doing it, but yes, if you have been sexually abused or assaulted, it is awful, and our culture often trains us to blame ourselves and to internalize that problem and not talk about it, but you do have to find a way to say, this does not define who I am, and I can still have a kind of life that will feel rewarding to me. And I think that's true also, not just of the rape victims in the book, but the king, Christian, is homosexual and has had to hide that in order to be a ruler and to be a good model for his country. And a lot of the things he does are cruel because there's this institutionalized cruelty of torture and death sentences. That's part of the time. Christian was actually one of the characters for whom I feel the most sympathy. Even though he does some bad things, he suffers a lot because he can't be the person he wants to be. And then Nicholas, who is kind of omnisexual, identifies the king's weakness and goes for it. Things don't work out as Nicholas plans, but there are dangers. So,
the reading of the king, his homosexuality, I realized that in the second read through. The first time it just kind of went over my head.
Really?
Yeah. I don't know how I read it. It was just, I guess I saw Nicholas as like the first person that he was actually really interested in. That it wasn't something that he had been fighting for a very long time, like trying to suppress it because he was the king and, frowned upon and looked down upon as a horrible, horrible sin at the time. And it really, I noticed it a lot more this time when I read through just stuff that Isabel had said. Just at one point she says something like, I know what you want. And that was really well done. I really liked that.
Well, thank you. And that's really important feedback to get. So I always worry that I overwrite something and so it doesn't leave enough for the reader to enjoy. And then sometimes I overcompensate. And I remember once I wrote about a character who was supposed to be sort of cunning and predatory, and I didn't want to make that too heavy-handed. And the feedback I got from my reading group was, it's kind of cliched that this guy is wise and he's advising this young woman. And it wasn't for this book; it was for something for a short story. I was like, wow, I was really afraid. Boy, did I miss the mark with that. And with this one, there's a plot element that I really worried was extremely obvious from the beginning. And I asked everybody who read it, like, did you know that was coming? And they told me that they did not, and that it was a surprise. I hope that it's true, because to me, since that was the idea all along, I was like, okay, have to try and be a little bit subtle and yet set it up so it's believable. And the way people believe things is interesting too to me historically and as a writer in general. Like the dark-skinned slave gets elevated to an apparent position of power. They dress her in the Countess's clothes and call her Eleanor, even though she is not. And it's just this a kind of convention that everyone is going to agree that as long as Isabel believes this is Eleanor, they will treat her as Eleanor, and she has Eleanor's privileges, which can be taken away once that story isn't useful to them anymore.
I've come across stuff similar to that, just like the power of names and like medieval lit and everything. So it's a very kind of like medievalist idea that I don't think you see a lot because our idea of identity is different now. Yeah. So I can see why that would be really weird for a lot of people. But
yeah. And I like the idea too that she's like, oh, I could leave at any time. Oh, yeah. Like, okay, I'll just go back now. And I thought that was really interesting too, just like how like her kind of world changes and she gets like this position that she could kind of use to her advantage, but she never even thinks about it. Like it's just, she's not sure exactly how the conventions or what people are thinking about her at the time would hold up if she tried to do something like leaving or like that. I thought that was really, really interesting.
Yeah, thanks. It's, she comes from a privileged background. She was a little girl in a harem, who was then captured and sold, and treated very brutally. I think you asked what the hardest scenes to write were, and those would be the rape scenes and the torture, which sometimes makes me depressed for like a week when I make something bad happen to a character I love. And I love Mitty Sorta, who's this enslaved character. She's not always nice because she's been treated very badly and she has to be cautious. And, that moment you talk about where someone tells her, you could walk away right now because people are treating you as Eleanor, so just act like it and see if you can go. That, I think, was an important moment for thinking about identity, and that also reflects on the way we think about race, class, gender, our own bodies now. Like, it's really fashionable among well-intentioned liberals to say, we live in a post-racial society, and I don't see color, I only see a person. And though it's sweet that they think that, of course it's not true, and in a lot of ways it shouldn't be true, because then you're erasing, a whole world of culture, special inflections. When you homogenize and you don't, in some ways the differences are good. I mean, yes, everyone should have the same privileges, and there were people from Africa, or from the East, mostly meaning the Arab world, who lived in Europe and were free and got to be scholars or doctors. But it was unusual, and they were always identified as the black doctor. Mm-hmm. And even if they were welcomed into some kind of society, it was always with a provision. And I wanted to explore how that would work out, especially given that Mitty comes from wealth, and then in some ways she has more power than Ava does, in part because she can read and write, mm-hmm. Thanks to her lover, Grammaticus. A flat name that means teacher.
I don't know. I think Mitty was the most practical character. Yeah. I never doubted her ability to survive. I figured she'd outlast everyone in this book.
She just took everything in stride and was like, well, this is how it's gonna happen, and just sailed, yeah.
Yeah. And she was, it took me about 9 years, actually, of writing to get that from the first few words to publication. And I'd thought about the characters and the plot for many years before that. It was a story I'd been telling myself for a long time, and I really, really love Mitty, and I feel close to her in a way I haven't felt close to my other characters. She's a sort of best friend, but a prickly best friend who I have to figure out how to speak to. And, I think she'll always get a certain amount of sympathy because of all the terrible things that have happened to her. So one of my challenges was trying to make Ava, who's more of an every woman kind of character, make her interesting enough to be there with Midi, and then Isabel, the queen, who is considered crazy, and with all the Mercury she's been around, may well be. And then there are the little princesses who have to, at the beginning, with Princess Sofia marrying the hairy Swedish man, when she's only 12, that came out of, my aunt gave me a book when I was 11 called The Thistle and the Rose. It was about Margaret Tudor marrying King James IV of Scotland when she was 12, and she was highly sexed, so her nurse knew that she needed to marry young, and I at 11 was and it was the norm for young royals. Like, as soon as you were able to procreate, you were needed in this endless chess game of alliances. But a fun historical fact is that commoners didn't marry that young. If you were really rich, you did, but if you had to establish your own household, the ages were about 25 for a man and early 20s for a woman, because otherwise, they didn't have enough skills to market to, take care of a family. And, the goal was always to have a family to take care of you as you age. Wish me luck.
One of our questions was, how did you come up with the title?
I am really bad at titles, but from the first moment I thought of this story, that's the title that came to me. And it's the only time that a title stayed with me from the beginning to the end. Now I have cat hair on my face.
We can't see it.
Fergus is in my lap. I had conceived of it as a story about a kingdom and political jeopardy, but it was a very personal story about how politics affect us as individual people. And everybody back then would constantly have something wrong. Terrible rashes or fleas and lice and other parasites that would feed on you. You were wormy. If you were sick, someone would cut you to drain out the bad blood. So whether you were healthy or sick, you smelled bad, and you had some kind of wound somewhere. Also, it's kind of a wink at the Middle Ages, because one of the English euphemisms for the lady parts is your little wound.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Which says a lot about how people thought about sex then. That if you have a vagina, you have a little wound. And then there's the man's masterly sword that is going to open that wound in you again and again. I don't know if you're going to want to include that on your website.
That's actually, it's really fascinating, because I'm like working through the title of the book now, and it's just like, yes, the majority of the characters are women.
Mm-hmm. So, Kingdom of Women. I don't know. It's amazing.
Yeah. have to, like, get to the correct headspace again. I'm, like, off gallivanting in my thoughts.